I decided to explore that old abandoned house, which stood dark and silent on the outskirts of the small town where I grew up. There was something undeniably seductive and unsettling about the idea of unraveling the mysteries of a place that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The sun was beginning to set, and the environment was shrouded in gloom that further accentuated the air of desolation that hung over the property. When I entered the house, the feeling of stagnation was almost palpable. Dust hung in the air like a thin fog, and every step I took made the floor creak beneath my weight. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and decay. After searching the main floor, I decided to go up to the attic, a place that seemed to be the heart of oblivion within that house. When pushing the wooden ladder and going up to the attic, the atmosphere became even darker. The dim light coming in through the broken windows could barely illuminate the dusty space. Among boxes covered in cobwebs and deteriorating furniture, something caught my attention. An old mirror leaning against the wall. The frame was ornate, but in poor condition, and the glass was covered in a thick layer of dust. Driven by curiosity, I started cleaning the mirror with my shirt sleeve. As the dust cleared, my own image began to reveal itself. At first, it seemed like a simple reflection, but then something strange happened. My mirror image began to move independently. I looked in the mirror and saw my own figure making gestures and expressions that I wasn't making. It was as if my reflection had a life of its own. At first I thought I was seeing things, but as time passed, the feeling that something was wrong intensified. My image in the mirror was beginning to show an evil look, its eyes glowing with a dark intent that I didn't recognize. The feeling of discomfort turned into deep uneasiness. I knew that what I was seeing wasn't just an illusion caused by the light or tiredness. That night, the nightmares started. In my dreams, shadowy figures stepped out of the mirror, their distorted and menacing forms approaching me. He felt as if he were being pulled into an unknown abyss, a dark, empty space that seemed to absorb everything around him. I woke up with my heart racing, the feeling of terror still fresh in my mind. The line between what was a dream and what was reality began to blur. Fear was beginning to consume every corner of my being, and I didn't know what was real and what was just a shadow of my own tormented mind. Determined to understand what was happening, I decided to return to the house. I couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more sinister lurking there, and the mirror seemed to be the key to that. However, upon returning, I noticed that the mirror had changed. The atmosphere around him was even more oppressive, and the old mirror seemed to absorb the light coming in through the broken window. As I approached the mirror, something immediately caught my eye. The reflected images were no longer just my reflection, but disturbing scenes were beginning to appear. There were images of people in danger, screaming for help in nightmarish scenarios. Some moments were so vivid that I could almost hear the screams and sounds of panic. Other scenes showed horrific crime events, as if the mirror was displaying memories of a violent and bloody past. Every time I looked in the mirror, the images became clearer and more intense. I could see agonizing details, as if I were watching a horrific film of events that took place in that house. The feeling of discomfort turned into an oppressive feeling of being constantly watched. It was as if the mirror was not just reflecting, but absorbing something from me. With each visit, the feeling of terror increased. The apparitions became more intense and threatening, as if something evil was manifesting itself through the mirror. I could feel the presence of an entity that did not belong to this world, a force that seemed to be trying to break through the barrier between the mirror and reality. The mirror seemed to vibrate with an evil energy, and I knew it was preparing for something horrible. My own reflection began to change, and the line between my image and what was beyond the mirror became increasingly blurred. The appearances in the mirror were so intense and aggressive that I could no longer distinguish what was real. I found myself questioning my own sanity, wondering if it was all just a delusion caused by fear and exhaustion. The terror intensified to the point where I realized the mirror was more than just an object. It was a portal to a terrifying dimension, and something was trying to come out of there and invade my reality. Every time I approached the mirror, the feeling of panic became unbearable, and I knew I was on the verge of discovering something horrible and unthinkable. Desperate to end the terror that dominated my life, I made a drastic decision. The mirror needed to be destroyed. Maybe if I could break it, this would all be over. With a hammer in hand and my heart racing, I returned to the house, determined to eliminate the source of all this fear. I arrived at the attic with the hammer in hand, and as I approached the mirror, I felt a strange and oppressive presence. My reflection in the mirror seemed to be watching me with an icy, malicious gaze. Even before I struck the first blow, the mirror seemed to react as if it had a mind of its own. The surface of the glass began to shake, and the images I saw began to distort and become even more threatening. When trying to break the mirror, something impossible happened. The glass defended itself almost as if it had a strength of its own. Each blow of the hammer caused the mirror to regenerate, its cracks closing instantly. It was as if the mirror were alive, a malevolent entity resisting my attempt at destruction. It was then that I discovered the horrible truth. In a disturbing vision that the mirror revealed to me, I realized that he had been created by a serial killer. This sick man used his reflexes to observe and torment his victims before killing them. The mirror was not just an object, it was a portal into a criminal's troubled mind, and he was using the mirror to continue his cycle of terror. The images became even more intense and visceral. I saw the killer in his last moments, surrounded by the reflections of his victims, their last expressions of horror and despair. The mirror was trying to find a new victim, and I was about to become that new victim. In a desperate attempt to end the cycle, I prepared myself for a final confrontation. With the mirror still resisting each blow, I realized I needed to face the entity controlling the mirror directly. The confrontation was brutal and terrifying. I felt as if I were fighting a supernatural force, something beyond human understanding. The battle was a nightmare in itself. The apparitions became physical, trying to pull me into the mirror, and the terror I had felt before intensified to an unimaginable level. I fought with all my might, trying to break the mirror and free myself from this terrifying prison. When I finally managed to break the mirror, the attic light illuminated the space with disturbing clarity. The mirror was destroyed, but the feeling of relief was only superficial. I knew something evil had been released, but I wasn't sure if the evil had truly been defeated or if it had found a new way to spread. The conclusion of the battle was open, and the terror I experienced left an indelible mark on my mind. The cycle of terror may have ended for me, but the echo of evil still resonated, and I couldn't help but wonder if the mirror had truly been destroyed or if evil had found a new way to manifest itself. My wife Laura and I have always dreamed of moving to a small town, away from the hustle and bustle of urban life. Finally, we found the perfect house, an old Victorian building at the end of a quiet street. When we arrived on moving day, the sun was starting to set, and golden light bathed the house in a welcoming glow. It seemed like the ideal place to start a new life together. However, as soon as we crossed the threshold of the house, something strangely disconcerting hit us. The peace we hoped for was there, but not in the way we imagined. There was absolute silence that enveloped the house like a heavy blanket. There was no sound of the wind passing through the trees, nor the distant murmur of other residents. The tranquility that had seemed so desirable now felt suffocating. The house, with its creaky wooden floors and walls covered in aged wallpaper, had an aura of nostalgia that, instead of being comforting, became increasingly oppressive. The silence was almost palpable, an invisible presence that seemed to settle over every surface. With every step we took, the sound of our own movements seemed to be swallowed by the emptiness around us. I tried to convince myself that it was just a matter of adapting, but the feeling of unease didn't lessen. As night set in, the silence became heavier, more crushing. Laura and I tried to remain calm, but the first signs of something wrong began to appear. Small noises began to appear, a creak coming from an upper floor, an inexplicable crack that seemed to come out of nowhere. Every sound was a reminder of the invisible presence that seemed to move around us, and the absolute silence seemed to amplify every noise. It wasn't just the sound, but the growing sense of discomfort that afflicted us. Each night as we tried to sleep, the house seemed to breathe with an unsettling regularity. The feeling of being watched was constant, and every small movement in the dark made our hearts race. The doors, which had once seemed so normal, now creaked with a frequency that seemed almost intentional. It was as if the house itself was trying to warn us of something, but the message was muffled by a veil of almost unbearable silence. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was certain. Something was terribly wrong with our new home. Days passed, and the silence in the house not only persisted, but seemed to have intensified. Laura and I began to hear unintelligible whispers during the night. Sometimes it seemed like someone was whispering something right next to us, but when we went to check, the silence took over again. It was as if the voices dissolved into thin air before we could locate them. Footsteps also began to echo through the hallways. They appeared irregularly, sometimes a sound of quick footsteps, other times a slow, deliberate gait. Each of these events made our nerves tense even more. We tried to rationalize all of this. Maybe the house was simply settling. Maybe there were problems with the structure that were causing the squeaks and pops. We thought the wind might be playing with the windows or the pipes were adjusting. But with each new night, each new sound, our explanations became more untenable. The house seemed to behave increasingly erratically. During the day, everything seemed normal. But when night came, the atmosphere became unbearable. It was as if the house was trying to torture us with an endless series of inexplicable phenomena. That's when we decided to investigate the history of the house. Laura found some old documents in a dusty closet in the attic, and we began digging through old records and newspaper articles. We discovered that the previous owner was a man named Elijah Hawthorne, a recluse who had lived here for over 50 years. Elijah's story was more disturbing than we imagined. According to records, he was a man who had a deep and irrational fear of some entity. He believed that the only way to protect himself from this threat was to create an environment of absolute silence. For him, silence was a form of shield, a way to prevent the presence from approaching. He had taken extreme measures to ensure that nothing disturbed his peace. The house was adapted to meet this belief. The walls were covered with special materials to muffle any sound. The windows were reinforced so that outside sound would not enter, and he had even installed an acoustic insulation system on the doors and in the bathrooms. Floors. To those who didn't know, the house seemed normal, but to Elijah it was a fortress against something invisible and threatening. As we discovered more about Elijah and his paranoia, the feeling of terror only increased. What did he fear so much that he built a prison of silence around himself? And most frighteningly, what could still be in the house, waiting, now that Elijah was no longer there to protect the silence? The feeling of being watched became even more palpable, and the house seemed to be responding to our growing fear with an increasing intensity of inexplicable events. We were beginning to understand that the silence was not just a strange feature of the house, but an integral part of something much more sinister. And each night, as the whispers and footsteps continued, the feeling that we were being watched became almost unbearable. The weeks that followed were an escalating nightmare. The silence, which before was merely uncomfortable, now seemed to have a presence of its own, almost palpable. As we went deeper into the night, the atmosphere became suffocating, as if the air itself was compressing around us. The silence was so intense that it seemed to be trying to swallow us, and increasingly, I felt as if we were being watched by something invisible. The whispers became clearer, the footsteps more frequent. They no longer came from an upper floor or a distant hallway. Now they seemed to be right next to us, gliding through the air as a constant reminder that something was very wrong. Laura and I would lie awake for hours, trying to make sense of our growing anguish. It was during one of these nights that we discovered the terrifying truth. I was exploring the attic again, sifting through more old documents, when I found a dusty diary hidden inside a wooden box. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. The diary was Elijah Hawthorne's. As I read, the accounts became more and more frantic. Elijah described a presence that fed on the silence he had created. He believed that the entity was drawn to stillness, and that as the silence deepened, the entity became stronger and more aggressive. The truth was more horrifying than anything I could have imagined. The entity wasn't just Elijah's irrational fear, it was real. And now, it seemed like it was feeding on our own anxiety, growing in strength and boldness as the silence grew more oppressive. The climax came on a particularly quiet night, when the pressure felt almost unbearable. Laura and I were in the main room, fear consuming us, when we began to hear a deep, unsettling sound. It was a muffled roaring that seemed to be coming from the walls, a sound that seemed to be getting closer to us. Panic set in. Every door slammed shut, and the air was thick with a sense of impending terror. In the final confrontation, the truth came out with shocking violence. As I faced the near silence of the house, the presence became visible. It was not a physical form, but a shadowy shadow that seemed to hover at the edges of my vision. The entity was a manifestation of terror itself, a force that fed on our own hopelessness and fear. With ragged breath and racing heart, I faced the entity. There was no escape, only direct confrontation with the horror that had infiltrated our lives. The house seemed alive with the sound of my own fear, and the entity seemed to feed on every unspoken scream, every terrifying thought. The aftermath was a whirlwind of emotions and a desperate fight for sanity. In a final moment of clarity, I realized that the absolute silence that Elijah had sought to protect had imprisoned him, and now we were facing the same prison. The only way to confront the terror was to break the silence once and for all, but the cost was immense. Laura and I made it out of the house, but we will never be the same again. The silence we sought was what nearly destroyed us, and the entity, fed by stillness, still looms in the darkness, waiting for its next opportunity to feed on fear. The house, now silent as ever, stands as a monument to the terror we faced, and each time silence settles around us, we feel the threatening presence reminding us of the horror we lived through. I always felt relieved when driving along that quiet road, especially after a tiring day. Living just 30 minutes from the suburbs made that evening commute something of a relaxing ritual. The road, usually deserted at night, provided me with a peace that contrasted sharply with the hectic traffic of the day. It was like a balm for the mind, a chance to slow down and finally leave the worries behind. That particular night, I was at home with the windows closed and soft music playing. It was a little after 10 p.m., and I was happy to be so close to home. The road was, as always, calm and silent, or at least it was that way until a blinding light appeared on the horizon. At first, I thought it was just a headlight from another car approaching, but as the light got closer, I noticed it was more intense and brighter than usual. It was almost as if the light was blinding me. I tried to concentrate and keep the car in my lane, but the light was so bright that I had to look away and aim for the shoulder to avoid losing direction. It was then that the sight became even more terrifying. The approaching car was driving in the wrong lane of the road, directly towards me. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. There was no time to think. My reflexes took over, and I swerved sharply to the right, trying to escape the imminent collision. The car slid down the road, leaving the road and falling into the ditch that bordered the forest. The sensation of impact was brutal, and for a few seconds everything was confused. The front of my car was completely destroyed, dented so grotesquely that it looked like a scene from a horror movie. I was stunned, but it seemed like I'd come out relatively unscathed. With difficulty, I unfastened my seatbelt and jumped out of the car. I was breathing heavily and with adrenaline pumping. When I managed to compose myself, I looked at the road and was surprised to see that the car that had caused the accident was stopped not far from where I was. I expected to see the headlights receding into the distance, but instead the vehicles had stopped and were now pulled over. My first impulse was anger. Those idiots almost killed me. But before confronting them, I decided it was best to call the police. I picked up my phone and called, reporting the accident and asking for help. The operator told me the police would arrive in 5 minutes, so I hung up and started walking up the ditch again, trying to stay as calm as possible. It was then that I was surprised by a man who was now at the top of the ditch. He didn't ask questions or worry about my well-being. Instead, he looked at me with a hostile look and said something I couldn't fully understand. The words he used, which sounded like a mixture of Russian and German, carried a threatening and aggressive tone. As I tried to process the situation, the light from the headlights of the cars on the road started to get even brighter and seemed to get closer to where I was. I was still in the ditch, but I could see it was the same car. The two men inside began talking loudly, gesturing with unsettling urgency. One of them ran to the back of the car and opened the trunk, but instead of getting something, he turned around and started approaching me along with the other man. My mind raced. and I realized the situation was about to get even more dangerous. Without thinking twice, I turned around and ran into the forest, trying to hide from their sight. The feeling of panic was overwhelming, and I knew I needed to get away as quickly as possible. They were big and seemed determined, and soon I was lost in the darkness of the forest, with no idea where I was going, just trying to stay out of sight as I listened to the sounds of their increasingly distant voices behind me. As I tried to regain my breathing and contact the police, the sound of the men's voices became closer and more threatening. I knew I needed help quickly, so I continued to try to remain calm and steady as I spoke to the operator. But as the headlights came closer and closer, I felt a growing tightness in my chest. The men's words, which until then had been distant, now echoed with a hostile and urgent tone. I looked up and saw that the men were descending the slope, their silhouettes becoming clearer in the blinding light. They were speaking in a strange language, a mixture of harsh, cutting sounds that I couldn't identify. They seemed to be discussing something, their expressions increasingly intense, and their gestures increasingly agitated. I didn't need to understand the language to realize that his intentions were not good. With my heart racing, I tried to climb back onto the road, but a feeling of dread paralyzed me. They were now so close that I could feel the tension in the air. With my adrenaline pumping, I knew I needed to act quickly to avoid a direct confrontation. With a cry of despair, I began to run into the forest, away from the approaching men. The darkness of the forest was almost total. The trees and bushes seemed to close in around me, making each step more difficult and uncertain. I ran aimlessly, trying to get as far away from immediate danger as possible, but the feeling of being lost was overwhelming. The sound of police sirens was still distant, a faint hope guiding me, but the path out of the forest didn't seem clear. The men were getting closer and closer. I could hear their heavy footsteps and their conversation, which now sounded like a determined chase. The feeling of being hunted was almost palpable. Every branch and every surrounding sound made me jump, and the fear became almost unbearable. The darkness of the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. I stumbled and struggled to keep pace, feeling the weight of my own labored breathing. Every time I looked back, I saw the light of men's flashlights moving through the trees, closer and closer. The impression of being surrounded by shadows and indistinct silhouettes made me even more terrified. I tried to stay calm, focusing on finding a way back to the road. The sound of sirens was there, but it felt like I was running away from it. The fear of being captured mixed with the frustration of not being able to find a clear path. I needed to keep moving, fight the panic, and keep looking for a way out as the men's relentless search continued behind me. After what seemed like an eternity of running through the darkness of the forest, I finally heard the nearest police siren. Hope gave me a final push, and I followed the sound as quickly as I could. The trees started to part, and I finally saw the road again. The sight of the police car was an indescribable relief, and I almost collapsed from exhaustion when I reached them. The two police officers were inspecting my damaged car, which was now in such a deplorable state that it looked like a heap of twisted metal. They looked up when they saw me, with expressions of surprise and concern. I explained what had happened, trying to remain calm and provide as many details as I could remember. I related the accident, the bright light, the behavior of the men, and my desperate escape through the forest. The officers listened intently, taking notes on everything I said, but it didn't seem like there was much they could do. They conducted a preliminary investigation, but except for the damaged state of my car and my own word, there was no concrete evidence. The men who chased me disappeared without a trace. The marks on the road where I had fallen into the ditch and signs of a struggle were not enough to follow a solid track. I spent hours at the scene of the accident, trying to make sense of what had happened. The feeling of insecurity was palpable. The men's attack, which initially appeared to be an accident, had become a much more complex issue. It was unclear whether what happened was a planned attack or if something went wrong and they were trying to cover up a mistake. When I was finally able to go home, the feeling of doubt and fear still accompanied me. Why were those men there? What exactly were they up to? The lack of answers and the absence of persecutors left a shadow over my mind. The question persisted. Was this a deliberate attempt to harm me, or just a sinister deviation from a plan gone awry? I was plunged into an unsettling uncertainty, with the feeling that the quiet, familiar road now hid a terror that could return at any moment. Every time I drove that road now, fear accompanied me. What was once a safe and familiar path now seemed filled with unknown shadows and dangers. The incident had left marks not only on my car, but also on my mind, and the feeling of insecurity persisted, like an echo of terror that never seemed to completely go away. If you found these stories as disturbing as I did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true horror stories that will chill your spine. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Your opinion is essential to us and helps shape the content you love. And remember, the nightmare doesn't end when you wake up. Until next time, if you have the courage to face more mysteries and horrors,